Hello everybody, and welcome to a video that has been much awaited and asked for about 18 months now, I think. This is the all about film for Fuji Acros II. Acros II is a medium film available in 35mm rolls of 36 exposure and 120. The old Acros Neopan, that was available as well in 4x5. And maybe some other sizes if I recall correctly. Honestly, this new stock would be stunning in sheet format, and it's unfortunate that it's not available as a sheet film. I'd personally really like shooting this as 8x10. As a note, the Acros II film is made by Ilford in the UK to Fuji's specifications. This means that it is somewhat safe to assume that the emulsion for Acros II is as close, from a chemical perspective, to Neopan Acros as any film could be. The Big Film database is the source I found, which indicates that Ilford makes this to Fuji spec. Now that said, Acros II is not exactly the same as the old Neopan Acros, and that's reflected in the spectral sensitivity curve and some other general performance aspects. Judging by some of the questions and comments I've gotten over the years about Acros II, there do seem to be some people who think it's just Delta 100 with a different label. We're also going to investigate that in the spectral sensitivity section. Right off the bat, my recommended rating for this film is 100 ISO. That speed works well and consistently. I did push it to 800 one time and had actually shockingly good results, especially given that this is a 100 ISO film, and usually those don't push to 800 very well. I also shot it at 50 ISO and developed it at 100 a handful of times, and that really did work very well. Acros II has some good capabilities in terms of exposure latitude. We'll talk about that a little bit more later on too. If you want to get the most out of this film, your developer choice will matter a lot. I hope I said that slowly enough because you guys really need to pay attention to that. This film was so incredibly developer dependent and developer and concentration dependent. Way more than the original Acros was. I mean, either that or some years later, having been making these videos for a long time now, it's also possible I'm just way more sensitive to the differences that different developers afford a film stock. So I guess the best tip I can give you here is check out the developers in this video and see which results you like the most. In terms of the subjects to shoot with this film, honestly, any subject is going to work. Acros II is great for portraits, landscapes, architecture, basically anything except high-speed action shots indoors. You could probably get away with it with a fast enough aperture if you're outside and close to the action. Grain affords a pleasing eye texture to images when visible. Most subjects benefit from the way that the grain in this film complements the natural textures of most subjects, and so to that end, grain is highly pleasing. Tonality and tonal range varies by developer. I could not make a definite connection between what characteristics of various developers result in different looks and those different associated results. I did have some developers I liked much more than others, and we'll cover them in the developer sections. Acutance across the developers I used was very good, with clear divisions between bright and dark points. Contrast depends heavily on the developer selected, with some, like Silvermax developer, returning flat results that could be manipulated very easily in post, versus Paranol S and its near two-tone results at 1+25. Sharpness was consistent and good across the image samples with Acros II, clearly having the capacity to outperform most, if not all, lenses by a significant margin. In fact, the datasheet indicates that Fuji, let's assume that Fuji wrote the datasheet. I don't see any reason to think they didn't. Anyway, they're indicating that depending on your contrast, the line per millimeter rating could be as high as 200 lines per millimeter, which is on par with, I think that's on par with T-Max, and maybe a hair sharper than some of the other 100 ISO black and white films on the market. It's a good performance. It's going to be better than most of your lenses. Dynamic range will also vary by developer, but in general, if you expose for midtones and then add maybe a quarter or a third of a stop of exposure, you'd be able to obtain good dynamic range in pretty much any setting. Digital conversion is fine, with images that yield slightly higher contrast than I typically like. This film does seem like one that would be better suited to a traditional darkroom printing process versus the digital workflow I use. I'd be very interested in hearing from people who do have a traditional darkroom and who use this film and who use other black and white 100 ISO films, how they feel that this film performs on paper versus digitized with a camera sensor. Since I don't have the space or equipment to do a traditional darkroom printing process, it's not something that I can really speak to, but I do think based on this film's performance, it really would be very well suited to black and white paper processing. Let's get interesting with this section this time. The spectral sensitivity curve is used to describe the film's relative sensitivity, that's the y-axis, to visible light colors, and that's the x-axis. Spectral sensitivity on Acros II is a bit interesting. It performs in a manner that is similar to Neopan Acros 100, that film being one of the most loved films of its time, by the way. Acros II is, however, far from identical to the old Acros. In practical terms, most people would struggle to identify the differences between the two identical images taken on the different stocks. However, the slight bump in the violet range of the Neopan, the old non-existent Acros, indicates that that stock likely had better shadow retention than does the new stock, which records the violets and deep blues a hair more darkly. Shadow tones, you're likely aware, are generally blue shifted. I've also been asked and read that there are rumors Acros II is just Delta 100 repackaged. So let's talk about that. Noting that the testing color temperatures are significantly different in these two spectral sensitivity curves, the Ilford would be expected with this different temperature to show a much lower blue sensitivity under tungsten light, and we don't see that. So we can assume from this that Acros II and Delta 100 are much different stocks. By the way, my experience with these films speaks to that, and I find that the images from Delta 100 look much different than those from Acros II. So what about Kentmere 100? Well, no one knows. The current Kentmere emulsion spectral sensitivity curves are not public. Thanks, guys, but to my eye, Kentmere 100 also does not look like Acros II. Kentmere 100 is on the schedule for August 12, 2024 for this video series, and when that arrives, the sample images in that video will almost certainly confirm that the images from Kentmere 100 have significantly different performance with the same developers versus Acros II. And as a note, by the way, the developer times for Acros II and Kentmere 100 are much different. These are not the same film stocks. So what was the point of all this? Simply to say that when people tell you Acros II is some other stock repackaged, second guess that. The images from the various film stocks do not support that theory, and credible sources online indicate that Ilford is making this on behalf of Fuji to Fuji's specifications, indicating that it, yes, is indeed its own separate film stock from anything else that Harman or Ilford are producing under any of their badges. For this test, I used the full rainbow of colors, all the standard red, orange, yellow, blue, green, added in pink, tobacco, and purple as well, purple being the CFL. Did all of this under full sun to get full spectrum light. All of this, then the roll of film I sent off to be developed and scanned at Old School Photo Lab. Now I did that so that the development would be accurate, of course, because they do a very good job, and then the scanning would be as neutral as possible. This would prevent me from inadvertently biasing any of the digitization in RAW or having different exposures in my camera because I forget to do a setting, which happens, I'm going to admit that. So this was the most reliable way to get good data. None of the filters showed strong contrast, which likely owes to the chemistry used by Old School Photo Lab and very possibly the fact that I could have stood to spend a little bit more money on the filters than I chose to. Filter quality affects filter performance a lot. Anyway, the red filter brings out some detail in the tree trunks and in the mountain ranges versus the no filter image. Orange filters look a lot like red, but some of the tree trunk detail is lost again. The yellow filter to my eye is indistinguishable from no filter, except in the sky a little bit, and the distant mountains where there is like slightly better contrast. I mean, maybe if you squint a bit. Green is, as is generally the case, making everything very, very muddy. Green is a trash filter. Green never does anything good for any image. I have not found a reason to use a green filter yet. Blue has no effect versus no filter insofar as I can tell. The tobacco filter now delivers a shocking performance with, so far, the best overall tonal range and shadow detail retention. Tobacco's generally another trash filter, by the way, but it really was interesting with Acros II. In fact, I can't think of another time I've seen a tobacco filter perform well with a black and white film. They just don't do it. Anyway, pink delivers skies that are basically the same tone as the far mountains are, and that also the pink also introduced very harsh contrast in the foreground. And lastly, the CFL contrast, the fluorescent countering filter, which is purple, looks about the same as pink, but with slightly better shadow retention in the foreground shadows. For this second series of shots, I did forget to take a no filter sample. Oops. But honestly, that should be fine. It's not going to tell you anything that the rest of this previous series couldn't tell you. This second series shows some interesting filter effects on how distant horizons are recorded on film, and this really relates to the difference between recording sky and ground and how the contrast for those colors is affected by filtration. Honestly, if you needed to pick one filter or two filters for this film, it's going to be the tobacco and the red or tobacco and orange. The rest of the colors, insofar as this film is concerned, can just go in the recycle bin. Reciprocity failure performance for Acros II is, like with all Fuji films, class leading. Fujifilm stocks outperform all other films in this regard. So what do I mean here for Acros II? For exposures from 120 to 1000 seconds, only an added half stop is needed. So what that means is let's say you take a meter reading. It's clearly very dark, and your meter says you need a 1000 exposure, that is 16 minutes and 40 seconds. You only need to add half of the metered time again to that. The same is true if you're at, let's say, 2 minutes and a second, right? You would have to add half that time again. That's your half stop. That is a staggering performance in terms of reciprocity failure. The datasheet does not go above 1000 seconds because this is not a film designed for 25-minute metered exposures. Okay, we're going to leave it at that. But let's say that, for instance, you're doing something like an architectural photo inside of a dark church building, right? And the only light is some like late afternoon light coming in through some stained glass windows behind you, right? That would be a setting where you might take a meter reading and be at something like an f22 to get a suitable depth of field, and your meter's like, yeah, you need 1500 seconds. If you were going to go over that 1000 second mark, I'd probably look at adding a stop to a stop and a half of added light. This film's very tolerant to overexposures, so if you err on the side of more light, you're going to be fine. The datasheet does not provide guidance on development latitude other than to indicate that the PIDC, which is Precision Iodine Distribution Control, technology in Acros II allows for stable processing results in multiple types of environments. This, in theory, should translate to the film having suitable exposure and development latitude. Now, I tested this film at 800 and found that it returned, actually, I was very surprised by this, usable results. Now, at 800, there were some curious image artifacts in one of the shots, but I honestly couldn't tell you if that had to do with the film, the chemistry, or the lens because I was using a little El Cheapo Corex camera. And I recall that being isolated to just one frame. Some mysteries about film performance are simply unsolvable, and this is one of them. Anyway, the massive development chart lists developer and ISO combinations from as slow as 40 ISO, and having used this film, I would say you could probably go to 25 ISO, but I wouldn't go any slower than that because I'm going to guess it would get kind of muddy at anything slower, even with pull processing. But anyway, as slow as 40 ISO to as fast as 1600 ISO. That's the massive development chart. That's I don't know who's out there shooting this stuff at 1600, but hey, kudos to you guys. I would never try that. I would never push a 100 ISO film that far. But when I took this to 800, it performed well. So if I were to pick a single 100 ISO film on the market to push to 1600, it would be Acros II. This film, empirically, has a lot of tolerance for abuse. I tried 15 different developer concentration combinations, but generally shot the film between 50 and 100 ISO, and then developed it as 100 ISO. Now, the exception there being the test that I did to push it to 800, just because I was kind of curious. This is, by the way, a glimpse of the future of this series, with film and chemistry costs rising and YouTube revenues dropping or remaining flat, really doing much more of the former. More of these videos will focus on the film stock's performance at box speed with a smaller sample size. The days of YouTube funding 40 rolls of this film to test 25 or more different ISO developer concentration combinations are rapidly ending. Now that aside, I did have 3 strongly favorite film developers. Top among them was Acufine at stock concentration. Asterisk that I did a batch of this where I did not mix it long enough and some of the unmixed crystals rested on the film during development, really ruined those images, but some of the Acufine character still comes through there, so they're included to kind of show that. And as a warning, with Acufine and really all powdered developers, mix well. Okay, a close second was Paranol S at 1+50. For those of you new to Paranol S, it's Rodinol. Or it's a chemically, I don't know if it's chemically identical or chemically similar. It performs in a manner very similar to Rodinol. To my eyes, I actually kind of like the way Paranol S looks versus Rodinol, just a hair more. Coming in third was HC110, which I used LegacyPro L110, but to the best of my knowledge, it's chemically the same as the current iteration of HC110, at a concentration of 1+31. All 3 of those delivered good dynamic range and tonality paired with pleasing image character and shadow and highlight preservation. An honorable mention in this category would be Silvermax Developer 1+30, though the negatives from that were a bit flat, especially and shockingly in full sun. So Silvermax Developer 1+30 may be a really good combination for those of you with a traditional darkroom process. I had very poor results with XTOL 1+2 and felt that developer combination is worth skipping entirely with Acros II. A close second worst was HC110, again LegacyPro L110 at 1+47. and rounding out the 3 worst was XTOL 1+3. I'm struggling to recall if there's been a time when the same developer appeared in both columns here with concentrations as close as these are. I wish I could use the data from my favorite and least favorite developers to make some kind of connection about developer types that would potentially work well and which likely won't. But honestly, the results I had with developers on this film are all over the board. Losing Neopan Acros 100 was a significant loss to the photographic community. It was, at the time, my favorite film, and I would argue that 10 years ago, Acros Neopan was very possibly the best black and white film on the market. Empirically, the Neopan stock seems to me to have had better shadow retention, though the new Acros II seems to do a bit better in the highlights. I also like the way that the new stock records warm tones versus the way the old stock did. Ultimately, I would struggle to pick out which film was which from 2 identical shots taken on the 2 different stocks, assuming both stocks were fresh and developed the same way. So, is Acros II a good inheritor of the love people had for Neopan? Yes, I would think it is. And Acros II is a very, very good film stock, and if it is your favorite, though it's not mine, I would support your choice as well-informed, understandable, and defensible. Wait, so Acros II is not my favorite 100 ISO black and white film? No, not even close. I still have another 100 ISO black and white film review coming out in, 20 days. Whew. And that's for a film stock that I like far, far more than Acros II. I would agree that Acros II does a good job of replacing Neopan. I think it fills a need, which is to have a film engineered by another company than Kodak and Ilford, even if it's not made by that other company, because film shooters need choice. We need competition to drive and improve the film market continually. The problem is that there are so many good 100 ISO black and white films on the market that replacing Neopan simply is not enough. Black and white film technology has advanced in the last decade, and the stocks now are better than they were then. And yes, someday I will rank my favorite black and white 100 ISO films for you. I don't yet know how Acros II will line up there, but I do know that as I approached this film's deadline, I looked at the stock I had left, around 8 rolls, and I gave them away. I knew I would have neither the time nor, frankly, the desire to use them, so I gave them to a friend of my wife's who takes lovely photos and would make much better use of the stock than I. The simple fact is this. In the 100 ISO black and white film class, a class of films occupied by stunning examples of excellent film technology and performance, being a very good film, being better than anything that existed 10 years ago, being better than many of the film stocks on the market today, honestly, it isn't enough.